Dan Kenner took a sip of bourbon and picked up his iPhone. He'd gotten a text message from his wife saying that she'd be late at work again and that he should have dinner on his own. Dan was a man who liked to plan. Since the evening was free, Dan decided to eat a cheeseburger at Whataburger and spend the evening with Lee Child's latest novel, Jack Reacher, and a bottle of Milam and Green 13-year-old bourbon given to him by his father-in-law. He'd been saving the bottle until the right moment, and this evening promised to be that moment. Dan took another sip of the bourbon and set the iPad aside on the end table, savoring the 111-proof amber liquid, 5% alcohol by volume, and reflecting on his current situation. Kendall, Dan's wife of 6 years, has been working overtime for the past 6 months. At the beginning of their marriage, they had agreed to put an equal amount each month into a joint checking account to pay bills and fund vacations, but their personal savings, checking, and retirement accounts were kept completely separate, and neither of them had access to each other's accounts. Kendall's income as a salaried employee was not increased by additional hours, so whether Kendall worked 40 hours a week or 60, her income remained the same. With separate personal accounts, Dan did not know whether Kendall earned little or a lot from her overtime hours. The amount they each contributed to the joint account was far more than they needed to cover expenses, and the balance had grown considerably. This division of accounts had been insisted upon by Kendall even before they were married. When he and Kendall first met, Dan's business was struggling due to the poor economy, and there were weeks and months when Dan refused to pay himself. That's the nature of business. The janitor gets paid before you do. Dan refused to lay off employees and dug deeper and deeper into his personal savings to keep his promise to himself that no one would lose their job. He went about his life step by step, and as night fell, he would close his workshops, and all he would discover was that he was a day older and even deeper in debt. Kendall was making a decent salary as a staff accountant at a Fortune 500 company and kept out of Dan's business. She feared his company would fail at this time and kept her at arm's length. During these difficult years, Dan lived off of savings so as not to burden Kendall, and although it was sometimes difficult for him to fulfill his obligation to replenish their joint account, he was always able to put his share into it, knowing that the storm would eventually pass. Dan was able to not only weather the storm, but to thrive. The collection of 3 auto repair shops he had inherited from his father had grown into a small chain of 12 locations over the past few years. In the next 3 years, he had purchased options on land that would allow him to expand the chain to 20 locations. All of the workshops were operating at a disadvantage, but Dan deliberately kept his wages as low as possible and invested the profits back into the business. Tire fitting equipment was purchased for each location, capable of mounting and balancing any size tire on any type of wheel, no matter how exotic. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment allowed his technicians to diagnose and fix drivability problems on nearly every vehicle manufactured in North America, Asia, and Europe. Except France, because screw a bunch of Peugeots. So Dan's business was going strong. Kendall's job was going well. It should have been the happiest time of their lives. But cracks appeared in their marriage. For Dan and Kendall, it was their second marriage. Dan's first wife had died when she was hit by an elderly female driver while going for her usual morning jog. It was a clear sunny morning with a slight October chill in the air. Because of the morning glare, the elderly woman driving to her doctor's appointment did not notice Kendall running down the street. City officials were repairing a damaged culvert, causing the sidewalk to collapse, and Lizzie had to run about 20 feet, 3 meters, across the roadway. That was all it took. 20 goddamn feet, 5 seconds of running, and 2 lives cut short. Lizzie didn't know it yet, but she was 4 weeks pregnant when she was hit by a car. It was the second instance of tragedy in the Kenner family. Dan's mother died of lung cancer when he was in middle school. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life when she developed a persistent cough and sought medical attention. 8 weeks after her diagnosis, she was gone. It was several months before Dan could begin to recover from Lizzie's death. His father appointed an acting manager at the workshop that Dan ran. This gave Dan time to grieve for his wife and the child he would never have. Dan might never have recovered if his father hadn't had a fatal coronary attack while driving home from his workshop in the evening. It made Dan forget about his pain and focus on business. People's livelihoods depended on him. It was through a careless accident that Dan met Kendall. The mechanic's apprentice had removed the radiator cap without waiting for the engine to cool when Dan walked by. Hot antifreeze spurted out onto Dan's chest, and he had to go to the emergency room. The waiting area of the emergency room was crowded with the kind of visitors you'd find in most cities. Open head wounds, overdoses, withdrawal syndromes, and a whole host of injuries and traumas typical of what the ER staff called BRIs, from the acronym Beer-Related Injuries. The seat next to Dan was empty, and Dan himself didn't look frightening, though he did look like he'd been doused with some greenish liquid that smelled faint and unpleasant at the same time. A tall, attractive brunette with a limp strode over to Dan and lowered herself into the empty seat next to him. Since the emergency room was crowded, they knew they would have to wait. They told each other about their injuries. Kendall had twisted her ankle while jogging after work, and briefly recounted their lives. There was an immediate attraction between Dan and Kendall. Dan invited her to dinner and she accepted. They became friends and quickly became a couple. Kendall divorced her first husband because of his emotional abuse and cheating, and told Dan from their first date that she had no tolerance for cheaters. They were married 15 months after they met. Dan took a sip of whiskey and reflected on his marriage. How did the old joke go? We've been happily married for 5 years. Unfortunately, we got married 6 years ago. For the first few years of their marriage, Dan and Kendall were happy to the point of ecstasy. They laughed together, they danced, they made love all the time, they had a good time together. The problem started after Kendall earned her MBA, qualifying master's degree in management, and was poached from the bank she'd taken a job at after college to work as an accountant for the Fortune 500 corporation she now worked for. Dan was supportive of her. He wanted Kendall to be happy and successful. There came a time when one of the senior vice presidents had to retire, and the senior director to whom she reported was applying for the position. The senior director position was vacant, and Kendall felt she had a very good chance of being promoted. She just needed to show that she really wanted the job. After a few months, Dan noticed that Kendall was becoming unhappy with him. Everything he did didn't seem right to her. Kendall began to disparage his work. To her, he was just a mechanic now, a grease monkey, a nickname for auto mechanics. She began to disparage him during every conversation. Her constant anger and irritation with her husband was bringing discord to their marriage. Kendall began working overtime to stay away from Dan. When she was home, she texted on her phone. Her phone. God, how he hated her phone. She was always on her phone. She secretly laughed at the messages that came in. She would turn the screen so her husband couldn't see who she was texting with or what the messages were about. She slept with the phone under her pillow. And then it turned violent. Kendall had always had a temper and was quick to anger. Usually it came in the form of a harsh remark or a sharp barb to the object of her anger. She was always quick to calm down and correct herself when her temper got out of control, and when Dan was the object of her anger, her remorse led to a night of great sex. However, Dan had noticed that her outbursts had become more frequent and prolonged, but without the sex that had made her temper somewhat tolerable in the past. A month ago, during an argument that Kendall got into for no good reason, she slapped him. In 6 years of marriage, neither Dan nor Kendall had ever raised a hand to each other. But she had slapped him, and it shook Dan to the core. The slap surprised Kendall, too, because she immediately apologized, but then came the coffee cup incident. A week after the slap, Kendall yelled at Dan because the oil change light on her BMW had come on and he hadn't changed it. Dan explained to Kendall, for the umpteenth time, that her BMW was serviced for free for the first 3 years, so it made no sense for him to change the oil if the BMW dealer would do it for free. Kendall yelled at Dan, "Just change the oil, asshole!" Dan had had enough of this nonsense. "I told you not to buy this car, but you just had to have this overpriced and unreliable piece of German crap. Now that you have it, you have to maintain it yourself. You make your own service appointment at the BMW dealer. That's your responsibility." Kendall became furious. She picked up the coffee cup and threw it at Dan's head. If he hadn't dodged, the phone would have hit him squarely in the forehead. He stared at Kendall in shock. She gave him an expressionless look, then turned on her heels and walked away without a word. Dan took another sip of whiskey. He heard the garage door open, signaling Kendall's return home. Dan picked up his cell phone and sent the text and the email he'd queued up. They were duplicates, sent to the same person and containing the same packet of information, so it didn't matter which one was received first or if one of them didn't reach. Dan was a firm believer in backup plans. As Tennessee Ernie Ford sang long ago, "If the right one doesn't get you, the left one will." Walking through the living room, Kendall cast a glance at Dan, comfortably ensconced in a soft armchair with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I'm going to change, and then I need to ask you about the strange activity on the joint account." Kendall didn't wait for Dan's reaction to her statement and headed for the bedroom. A few minutes later, Dan heard the shower turn on. Both Dan and Kendall had set up notifications in their banking apps for unusual activity. Dan received the same text notifications that no doubt worried Kendall. He sighed, took a sip of bourbon, and set the iPad aside, waiting for Kendall to return. She returned 15 minutes later, dressed in black yoga pants and a white t-shirt exposing her stomach, and sat down on the couch across from Dan. Her wet hair was swept back after her shower, and although she hadn't applied any makeup, she was a stunningly beautiful woman. Her body was slender and athletic, topped with C-cup breasts that, at the moment, were unencumbered by a bra. "Do you know about these deductions from the joint account?" she asked. There was a slight accusatory tone in her voice. She held out her cell phone to Dan. Their bank's app was open to check the activity of their joint checking account. The balance was $12, while the day before it showed over $30,000. Dan nodded his head. $12,000 charged to PDSC? That's Pendragon Security Consultants. That's to pay them for following you around for a month and documenting your affair with your boss. $18,000 ACH to the SKD account? That's the fee to Solomon, Klein, S. Davis, my divorce attorneys. He took a sip of his bourbon and watched Kendall's reaction. Tears came to her eyes and her mouth opened and closed like a fish in water trying to find oxygen. Her face flushed red, and for a moment Kendall seemed to be at a loss for words. Dan watched the emotions play across her face. Fear turned to sadness, which turned to anger, and then back to fear. She seemed stuck, and it wasn't until Dan raised her glass to take a sip of bourbon that she seemed to decide what to say. "It didn't mean anything," Kendall said. "I just got involved in something I couldn't control. I'm going to end it right now. I don't want a divorce." "Didn't you say you couldn't stand cheaters? What did that mean to you?" "If you ever cheated on me, I'd divorce you," Kendall said, looking at her hands clenched in her lap. "That sounds like a smart plan," Dan said. "I don't want a divorce," Kendall repeated. "What did you think was going to happen when I found out?" Dan asked. "I didn't think you'd find out," Kendall answered honestly. "I thought our affair would end and you and I would go back to normal. And the disrespect, the anger and violence, was I supposed to just let it go? I never disrespected you. And there was no violence," Kendall said, her voice rising slightly as she refuted Dan's accusations. "Did you sleep with him in our bed?" Dan asked. Kendall gasped and the blood rushed from her face. "Yes," she said quietly, "but I didn't mean to disrespect you." "Oh, well, that's all right then. If you meant no disrespect to me, that's fine," Dan said with a hint of anger. "You slept with your lover in our marital bed, in our marital home, and you don't think that was disrespectful to me." "And you say there was no abuse?" Dan laughed sardonically. "You slapped me and threw a coffee cup at my head, so yes, there was violence. We can get past that. I don't want a divorce," Kendall insisted. "We can work this out. I'll make an appointment for us to see a marriage counselor." Dan shook his head. "The problem wasn't our marriage. It was your infidelity. I agree that counseling is necessary, but not to fix our marriage. You need to fix whatever is broken in you. If your boyfriend was single, you'd be out of here on your first cigarette puff. He's not getting a divorce, so I'm your plan B. Well, the hell with this mess." "I don't want a divorce," Kendall repeated firmly. You'll change your mind, Dan said with a wry smile. Kendall's phone buzzed with incoming notifications the entire time she and Dan were talking, but she ignored them, turning to Dan. When the incoming call came in, she lowered her eyes irritably. You should probably answer it, Dan said. Kendall got up from the couch and headed into the master bedroom for some privacy. As she left, Dan picked up his phone, opened a few apps, and hit the send button. Dan heard Kendall's muffled voice, but couldn't understand her until she spoke loudly. What did he do? A few minutes later, Kendall returned to the living room. Her face was red, and her eyes squinted and angry. Did you tell his wife? You told his wife? She screamed. How dare you try to ruin his marriage? You have no right. They have 2 little boys. How could you hate her so much, you miserable asshole, you miserable piece of shit? I will never forgive you for hurting her like that. Dan looked at Kendall, puzzled. So, you don't think he's a cheating asshole for cheating on his wife? And I'm a cheating asshole for telling her he's cheating? You got some goddamn logic, baby. You don't think you and your boyfriend are miserable pieces of shit for lying and cheating on their spouses, and I'm the bad guy for bringing it out? Dan shook his head and grinned. In his quest to understand infidelity, he had recently read about the twisted logic of cheaters, but to see it exemplified by his own wife was just crazy. This is between you and me. You had no right to interfere in their marriage, Kendall shouted, her face crimson with anger. Your boyfriend had no problem interfering in my marriage, so I have no problem interfering in his marriage. If he's cheating on her with a coworker, there's no telling what kind of skanks, whores he's cheating with. She should protect herself and get tested for STDs. He's not like that, and he's clean. Since the first thing you do when you get home after working late is take a shower, I'm assuming you have unprotected sex with him. You should get tested too. I got tested for my own peace of mind, even though we haven't had sex since you started your affair. Kendall looked at her husband in shock. He'd known about this for months, and acted like everything was fine while he hired private investigators. Who was this man? You just wanted revenge. You're pathetic, Kendall said. Dan noticed again that her phone was buzzing with incoming notifications, which she ignored while she hurled insults at him. When she paused to catch her breath, her phone rang. You should probably answer it, Dan repeated, taking another sip of bourbon. Kendall headed into the master bedroom again to answer the call. Dan made a call on his iPhone and quickly muttered into the receiver. He then opened the recording app on his iPhone and leaned it against the lamp on the end table next to the chair. The phone was videotaping Dan while keeping the line open so the person on the other end of the line could hear what was going on. Dan sat leaning on his arms and waited for his wife to return. He didn't have to wait long. Kendall practically flew into the living room. You posted this on Facebook, she screamed. You put it on Facebook and tagged all my family and friends. You tagged Pastor Riley? Well, yes, but to be fair, I also posted it on LinkedIn so all your professional connections could see it too. Kendall screamed in frustration and anger, then threw her phone at Dan's head. He closed his eyes as she leaned back for the throw and braced himself for the impact. When the blow followed, it was much harder than he expected. He nearly passed out when the phone hit his forehead, but he managed to keep his composure. He knew she was going to do something, and sitting still to keep from killing the bitch was one of the hardest things he'd ever had to do. Kendall jumped over the space separating them and started punching him in the face. Dan felt his lips split open, and the copper tang of blood rushed into his mouth. It hit his nose, and for a moment, Dan's vision blurred. Finally, it got to the point where he stopped sitting up, leaning on his arms, and covered his face with his hands as she continued to beat him. Kendall screamed, I'm going to kill you, you bastard! I'm going to get a gun and blow your fucking head off! Finally, Dan stood up and took a few steps away and gently pushed her away, leaving the couch between him and Kendall. If the 911 operator Dan had called had done everything right, he would only have to wait a couple minutes for the patrol car to arrive. That's exactly what happened. Kendall looked at Dan with eyes full of hatred, her chest heaving as she took deep breaths. She tried to calculate the best way to get to Dan, to the left, to the right, over the top of the couch. Before she could come up with a plan of attack, the doorbell rang. You should probably answer the door, Dan said, his voice flat and unemotional. Kendall wrinkled her nose and squinted her eyes, looking Dan in the eye. She paused, then turned on her heels and headed for the front door. Kendall swung the door open and 2 police officers stood before her. She spoke to them, looking back at Dan every few phrases. The officers and Kendall were too far away for Dan to make out their slurred conversation. He saw Kendall gesticulating vigorously and pointing her finger at him. Dan saw Kendall step aside and allow the officers to enter their home. She led one of the officers past the living room toward the kitchen. The second officer approached Dan. "Mr. Kenner, I'm Patrolman Diaz and my partner is Patrolman Agnew. Your wife tells me that you were violent toward her tonight. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Did you touch her?" Dan shook his head. "No." "I confronted my wife about her affair. She attacked me." Dan pointed to his face. He could feel blood on his face from the impact of a dropped cell phone. He could also feel a busted lip. "I was the one who called 911. She's gotten aggressive lately. A month ago she slapped me, and a week later she threw a coffee cup at my head. I dodged it. But if I hadn't, I would have had to go to the emergency room." "I recorded today's confrontation. Would you like to see the video?" Patrolman Diaz definitely wanted to see the video. Dan made a few tapping motions on his iPhone and then handed the phone to the policeman. Patrolman Diaz silently watched the video, raising his eyebrows at the scene of Kendall pouncing on Dan. The cop looked at Dan skeptically. It looked like there had been a conversation before the tape. Was anything said that could have escalated the situation? Dan shrugged. She found out that a private detective had been following her for a month and that I had passed the results of the investigation on to her lover's wife. She wasn't happy about it. The policeman grinned. "You don't do things by halves, do you?" As one guy said, "I light my way forward by the light of the fires of the bridges burning behind me." "Okay, Dylan McKay." The officer shook his head and smiled. His partner came out of the kitchen and they conferred with each other. The second officer shook his head and nodded toward Dan. Patrolman Diaz played his partner the video on Dan's phone. His partner rolled his eyes and shook his head. Kendall's explanation was very different, but she didn't know she was being recorded. Patrolman Diaz turned back to Dan. "We're arresting your wife for domestic violence and terroristic threats. I suggest you take out a restraining order." Patrolman Diaz opened the front door as his partner led Kendall out of the kitchen with her hands cuffed. She was crying and beginning to choke. "Dan, don't let them do this to me. Please, if you ever loved me, make them let me go. I promise I'll be good." Dan rolled his eyes and turned to the officer who handed him a business card. "The card had my email address on it. Send me a copy of the videotape." As the patrol car pulled away, Dan called his attorney, Dwight Solomon. "It went exactly as I suspected. She was just arrested and taken to jail. Stay calm, Dan. If she shows up tomorrow, you know what to do." The next morning, as Kendall was leaving the courthouse accompanied by her parents, she was stopped by a 20-year-old blonde woman chewing gum. "Excuse me," she said, stopping in Kendall's path. "Are you Kendall Kenner?" "Yes," replied a very tired, hungry, and irritated Kendall Kenner. "Who are you?" "You've been served," the blonde replied, holding out an envelope to a shocked Kendall. The blonde smacked her gum and turned her back to Kendall and walked away. "What is this crap?" Kendall called out to the blonde in the back. "I don't know. I don't care," the blonde replied over her shoulder. "But I'd say you're probably fucked, whatever it is." Kendall opened the paper with anger and saw the inscription, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." "What an asshole!" she yelled to her parents. The morning was not an easy one. Kendall was awakened early and taken out of her jail cell and taken to a holding cell on the other side of the building. She sat in the cell for an hour before meeting with her attorney. She was allowed to make one phone call the night before, and she called her parents, who immediately began leaving voicemails at various law offices so they could get to work the next day. They contracted with the first attorney who called them back the next morning and were assured that Kendall would be represented at the hearing. The judge set bail for Kendall at $10,000, which meant she would have to either post the entire amount or pay a bail bondsman 10% and then put up real estate as collateral. The judge also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting her husband, showing up at his home or his work. She had to make arrangements with her attorney to remove her belongings from the home. Kendall's attorney objected to this, but then was shown pictures of Kendall's husband. The objection was withdrawn. Upon leaving the courthouse, the first thing Kendall's parents did was drive her across the aisle to McDonald's. She was booked into the Denton County Jail too late to eat dinner, and jailers woke her up early for a morning court visit, so she missed breakfast. Kendall hadn't had dinner the night before, preferring to spend time in bed with her boss, Tony. She had planned to snack on leftovers from the refrigerator when she got home, but that plan had fallen through. She wondered how she'd ended up here. She and Tony had just finished their second round of sex when the alert tone on her phone rang. While Tony dozed beside her, she checked her phone, expecting to see a message from Dan. Instead, she saw a message from the bank about a low balance. She quickly logged into her bank's app and immediately saw that there were only a few dollars in the joint bank account. After lunch, the account received 2 ACH withdrawals, one for $12,000 and one for $18,000. A Google search of the payees yielded nothing. Kendall realized that this could mean they had been ripped off or that the bank had made a mistake. Kendall was a smart woman. She also realized that it could mean that Dan knew about her affair and had emptied the checking account. However, she didn't believe that. She knew her husband and knew he wasn't afraid of confrontation. If he suspected her of cheating, he would certainly tell her. Dan Kenner was not the kind of man to let something like that pass his ears. She knew that, and yet here she was, lying next to her boss in a cheap motel after sex that was spectacular in its mediocrity. Not for the first time, she wondered what she was doing here. Kendall had always had it easy. She had always been the prettiest and smartest girl in class. She was rarely the most popular because the other girls didn't trust her. She learned at an early age to use her sexuality as a weapon, and it was a weapon she pulled out without hesitation. It started with Mr. Campbell, her high school math teacher. A few blowjobs earned her an A+. Letting Miss Donovan sleep with her earned her an A in economics. She never dated high school boys, only men who had graduated from college and had good jobs. College was a repeat of high school. If she had trouble with her classes, she slept with a professor. Both men and women. They all wanted Kendall. She graduated from college in 4 years with a degree in finance. She thought about law school, but knew she wasn't a strong enough student. You can't work your way through law school sex. To Kendall, her current affair with Tony Geyer, the senior principal to whom she reported, meant nothing. It was a means to an end. If she could get some recreational sex, which her previous love had called athletic, in the process of her promotion, so much the better. It was during her second year at Chase Bank that she met Kyle Evans. Kyle had visited her branch of the bank as part of an investigation into the possible money laundering activities of a suspected drug dealer. Kyle was assigned to the Special Operations Division of the Denton County Sheriff's Department, and his long hair, mustache, and carefree attitude immediately turned her on. She brazenly asked him out for a drink and climbed into bed with him at the end of their first date. For Kendall, the sex was mind-blowing, and she was crazy about Kyle. 2 months later, they started living together. After another year, they were married. For Kendall, married life was a revelation. She loved Kyle and wanted to do everything in her power to give him pleasure. Domestic or sexual, it made no difference. Kendall and Kyle were perfect together. Until it ended. They had been married for 4 years and were actively trying to have a child. They hadn't had any luck yet, but they were enjoying trying. In the middle of their 4th year of marriage, Kyle was asked to go to a 4-week course organized by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Organization. Although he would be gone for a month, having the ATF course on his resume would help Kyle with promotions. The trip wasn't difficult. The first week of Kyle's absence, Kendall was lonely, but good. The second week was a little more difficult as the hormones combined with the loneliness increased her arousal. By the end of the 3rd week, Kendall was crawling up the walls. In the 4th week, Kendall agreed to go out for drinks with Bill Williams. Williams, known as Bill Squared, or more commonly Square, was her husband's former partner in the Denton County Sheriff's Department. Kendall didn't know exactly what had led to their rift, but she knew they were no longer friends. She'd accepted his invitation for a drink with the vague thought that she could help bridge their differences. Besides, he was a good-looking man and she was lonely. What could be worse? Kyle had performed well in the ATF class. He was leading the class, which was important because in the last week, whoever was in first place got to take the final exam 3 days early. If they passed the exam, they could leave early, and if they failed, they had to stay until the end of class. Kyle passed the exam and 3 hours later was sitting on a plane headed to DFW, Dallas Fort Worth International Airport, to surprise his wife. It was 4 in the morning when the Uber dropped Kyle off in front of his darkened house. In the driveway, he recognized the car of his former partner, Square. Kyle's heart clenched into a cold fist as he unlocked the front door and entered the house he shared with Kendall. Leaving his suitcase by the front door, he quietly made his way to the bedroom. The room was partially illuminated by the light from the master bathroom. Square was lying on his back naked. Kendall was lying on her side, facing him. Her arm was thrown over his chest, the same way she slept with her husband. Kyle pulled out his cell phone and began filming the sleeping couple. After 30 seconds of filming, he took a few pictures and put the camera away. Kyle then approached the bed from Square's side, Kyle's side until tonight, and clasped his hands together, interlacing his fingers. He then raised both hands above his head and brought them down with all his might on Square's friend. The piercing scream that escaped Square's lips awakened Kendall from her orgasm-induced dreamless sleep. When she awoke, she was startled and disoriented. She saw Bill crying and clutching his groin with both hands. She saw her husband standing over them, but for a moment her brain couldn't comprehend what was happening. Then, everything fell into place. Kendall looked at her husband with a frightened expression on her face. She slowly realized the full horror of what was happening. Her husband looked down at her. His face was red with rage as he looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife. "I'll be back at 3 to get my things. I'll be done by 6. Don't be here at this time. I won't be held accountable for my actions if I see you, and you're not worth going to jail or losing your job." Kyle grabbed Square by the hair and lifted his face up to look into his eyes. "You're a pathetic piece of shit. I'll send a copy of the videotape to your wife and HR. You can go and quit today because your career is over and so is your marriage." Kyle gave him one last punch on his nose, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make blood rush out of it. He turned on his heels and left the house and Kendall. Kendall sighed, remembering how hurt Kyle had been over her cheating. Her strong husband had been devastated, and she feared he would never recover. He had rejected all her attempts to contact him. He didn't want to see her or talk to her. The divorce went through and her parents supported her, explaining that it was not her fault in any way. Kyle must have been very cruel to have hurt Bill so much. His cruelty would have led to the demise of their marriage sooner or later. Her story turned into a story of neglect and abuse on his part. Didn't he show his violent tendencies when he confronted Bill? As Kendall and her parents rewrote history, making herself look like a victim, she became the hero of her story. A brave girl who did what she had to do to escape the brute her husband had become. Only once was her fiction thrown in her face. Kendall was shopping at Engstrom's in Dallas when she came face to face with her ex-husband. With him was a tall, slender woman. She had red hair and an athletic build. She seemed vaguely familiar. She was pushing a stroller. Kendall's eyes widened as she saw her ex-husband for the first time in 5 years. "Hi, Kyle," she stammered. "Hi, Kendall," he replied nonchalantly. She extended her hand toward the woman. "Hi, I'm Kendall. I used to be married to Kyle." "Oh, yeah, I've heard all about you," the woman replied, shaking Kendall's hand. Kendall blushed at that. "Nothing good, I'm sure." "Some of it good, and some not so good," the woman replied. "I'm Corey Calloway. I'm Kyle's wife. This is our son, Kyle Jr." Kendall looked at the sleeping infant. The hardest thing in her life was keeping a smile on her face looking at her ex-husband's new family. "He's a beautiful baby. You're lucky you married Kyle. He's a good man. It was good to see you again, Kyle." Kyle only gave her a disdainful look, took the woman's hand, and, pushing the stroller, headed for the men's department. A few days later, watching the local evening news, Kendall was shocked to find that the news anchor was the same woman she had seen with Kyle. That's why she seemed familiar. Kendall typed Corey Calloway into Google and discovered that she was a fast-rising media talent who might end up on one of the national cable news channels. Local media watchers have noted that while she's good enough, otherwise not necessarily profligate or boring enough, for Fox News, her intelligence is more suited to MSNBC, though she'll have to develop a more condescending tone if she moves to that channel. For now, she's been hugely popular on local news. Kendall cried herself to sleep that night and every night for the next week until she remembered her fiction. Kyle was violent and emotionally abusive, wasn't he? It was only a matter of time before his new marriage ended as well. Kendall forced herself back to the present, contemplating how the divorce would turn out for her. After eating an egg muffin, Kendall demanded that her parents take her to their house. "That's not a good idea, honey," her father said. "I need to talk to Dan. I need to explain to him what happened. We can work things out." "Ken," her mother began, "I don't think this is a good idea." The judge said, "I don't care what the judge said." Kendall snapped at her mother. "Just take me home." Kendall's parents walked her to the front door and watched her ring the doorbell. They stood waiting for a couple minutes, and then Kendall rang the doorbell again. When nothing happened again, Kendall started pounding on the door. Dan made a quick phone call and opened the door without removing the chain. "You can't be in here. There's a restraining order to keep you out." "I live here," Kendall said. "How can we fix our marriage if I'm not here?" Dan looked at Kendall incredulously. "Fix it? I'm divorcing you. We're not fixing anything. I'm not going to stay married to a lying, abusive cheater. You need to get out of here." Dan closed the door, which made Kendall furious, and she started pounding on the front door. "Let me in, you chicken shit motherfucker! You haven't seen violence yet until you see what I'm going to do to your cowardly ass! Open the door right fucking now!" She began pounding frantically on the door. Kendall's parents, seeing that their daughter was upset, began pounding on the door as well. As their daughter became more and more upset, their calls to Dan became louder and more emotional. "Open the door, Dan, or I swear to God I will kill you. I'll cut your heart out with a steak knife," Kendall screamed. "Open the damn door, you fucking grease monkey," Kendall's father yelled. "I'll put you down, boy." Dan sipped his coffee and shook his head, watching the video from the doorbell camera. He watched as the patrol car pulled into the driveway and as two officers approached the porch. The officers spoke to the group for a minute, and then one of them separated and rang the doorbell. Dan opened the door and invited the officer in. After verifying Dan's identity, the officer asked him to tell his story. He noticed cuts and bruises on Dan's face. "Last night I confronted my wife about her affair. I have proof of this affair because I hired a private investigator. During the confrontation, she became enraged and attacked me," Dan said, pointing to the bruises on his face. "She was arrested last night and appeared in court this morning. She was issued a restraining order prohibiting her from appearing in her home." Dan handed the officer a copy of the restraining order his lawyer had emailed him. "I have this too," Dan said, showing the officer his camera. He pressed play and they watched a video of Kendall and her parents banging on the door and making threats. The officer only shook his head as he watched them. "Well, that seems clear and understandable. Send me a copy of the videotape," the officer said, handing Dan a business card. He then turned on the microphone on his shoulder and requested 2 more cars for a few more arrests. "Stay inside and watch this shit show from your camera. Don't leave the house until I tell you to." That's how it went down. The officer called his partner in for a counseling session. They reviewed the video on his phone and then approached Kendall and her parents, where they were informed that they were all under arrest for trespassing and terroristic threats, and that Kendall was arrested for violating a restraining order. When 2 more patrol cars showed up, the officers proceeded to arrest Kendall and her parents. Kendall's mother became hysterical, and Kendall began crying and cursing at the officers. Kendall's father tried to push the officers away to get to his wife and was knocked to the ground. Shit show is putting it mildly. Dan called his attorney and left a message. "Kendall and both of her parents were just arrested. I think I married into a family of idiots." Leroy Keys felt defeated and depressed. He, his wife, and daughter were arrested Friday night for trespassing and threatening his son-in-law. Because they were arrested Friday night, they sat in jail all weekend, waiting to see a judge Monday morning. Leroy and his wife received restraining orders ordering them to stay away from Dan's home and business. In addition, Kendall's bail was revoked, and she was to remain in jail for violating a protective order and making terroristic threats against Dan. Leroy and his wife, Sarah, managed to get out of jail, but Kendall would remain in jail for the foreseeable future. In the back of his mind, he realized that he had failed in his role as a father in raising Kendall. She was spoiled, narcissistic, and possibly narcissistic, but at the same time she was his little girl. His wife spent the weekend sharing a cell with Kendall. Sarah didn't want to discuss what they had talked about, but when Sarah was released, she looked angry and determined. About what exactly, Leroy had no idea. Leroy called the lawyer he had used when Kendall had first been arrested. After explaining the situation to the lawyer, he sympathized with Larry, but the lawyer said he was going on vacation and would be away. That was true, but at the same time, a very fortunate coincidence because he thought the whole family was nuts and wanted nothing to do with them. Leroy flipped through the yellow pages, calling lawyers until he found one who could take him on right now. If Leroy knew anything about lawyers, that would be the first red flag. Raleigh Cruz was not at all what a lawyer should look like. Skinny, balding, with a hooked nose and small, narrow eyes, Raleigh more than remotely resembled a buzzard sitting on a power line waiting for its prey to die so it could pounce on the carcass. A vague phrase from a long-ago literature class popped into Leroy's mind. Something about a stingy and hungry stare. Some ambulance hunters were advertised on television and billboards. As you went down the career ladder, some ambulance chasers were advertised on bus stop benches. Raleigh Cruz had a look on his face like he was advertising in massage parlors and on Fox News Channel. Raleigh smiled predatorily as Leroy handed him the business card that was in Kendall's divorce packet. The smile was soon replaced by a grimace. Solomon, Klein, and Davis? What the hell? I thought you said your son-in-law was a mechanic. How can he afford an SKD on a mechanic's salary? He owns several repair shops, Leroy said. I don't think he actually works on cars. Raleigh rolled his eyes, deciding not to rely on his new customers for information. He turned to his computer and did a quick Google search on the name Dan Kenner of Kenner Automotive. 12 places. Not bad. That looked promising. His business has 12 locations. That should be quite an asset to your daughter in a divorce. Maybe we can get him to pay all my fees, too. Raleigh wasn't actually rubbing his hands together in anticipation, but it didn't take a fertile imagination to picture him doing it. Go fuck yourself. Raleigh looked at his cell phone in bewilderment. He had left a message for Dan's attorney, Dwight Solomon, who finally returned his call. Raleigh demanded an immediate meeting with Dan Kenner and his attorney to arrange for temporary spousal maintenance. Dwight answered Raleigh and then disconnected the call. Raleigh immediately called Dwight Solomon back, intending to read him the Riot Act and teach him a lesson in professional courtesy toward fellow members of the legal profession. What part of fuck you did you not understand? Dwight Solomon asked without salutation or preamble. You want to play hardball? Then we'll play hardball, Raleigh said to himself, placing his cell phone on the table. Why didn't you tell me there was a video? Yelled Raleigh at his clients. I looked like an idiot in that conference room. Raleigh finally managed to get in touch with someone at Solomon, Klein, and Davis. A first-year associate called Raleigh to set up a time for a pre-conference. Raleigh's clients were not to attend this first conference. The entire conference was an unpleasant experience for Raleigh. From the moment he walked into the SKD law office until he slipped out the door, it was one long attempt to embarrass and humiliate Roland Cruz, Esquire. It started when Raleigh walked into the reception area and gave his name to the receptionist. He figured that if a dog turd left to dry on the sidewalk suddenly grew arms and legs and grabbed a briefcase and announced his intention to practice law, he'd get just as warm a reception as Raleigh. He was directed away from the waiting area to a small conference room and told that he would be brought in shortly. Will be brought in. She did say he would be brought in, as if he were a stick thrown to a dog. Raleigh sat in the small room for 20 minutes before someone brought him in. A child. Or at least, she seemed like a kid to Raleigh, barely out of high school. In fact, Lauren Davis was 32 years old, a graduate of Yale Law School. Some might think that it was the fact that her father, Lawrence Davis, was a named partner that allowed Lauren to get a partnership quickly. They would be wrong. It was her inherited natural ability and aptitude for law that had made her a junior partner before her 30th birthday. Raleigh knew none of this. He only glanced at Lauren and mentally brushed her off. When Raleigh sat down in the large conference room, he was shocked to see Lauren taking the seat across from him. Her eyes read amusement as Raleigh began to list his client's requirements. As Raleigh listed the demands, that amused look became more and more wolfish. They have footage of your daughter assaulting her husband. They have footage of your daughter violating a restraining order and making death threats. They have footage of you and your wife making death threats. They had a prenup that you somehow forgot to mention to me. You made me look like a freshman student instead of someone who has been practicing law for 30 years, Raleigh said bitterly. The whole thing had been a humiliating experience for Raleigh, and he was furious. I'm firing you as clients. Go find someone else to do your shit. And here's my bill for your wasted time. Now get out of my office. Kendall and her parents looked at Dan from across the conference room table. Kendall had dressed to the hilt and knew she looked good. She wanted her husband to see what he was throwing away. Dan looked at Kendall in silence, ignoring her attempts to make him regret his decision to divorce her. They had agreed to all the points of the divorce. There was nothing to divide. Each would take what they entered the marriage with. Dan had purchased the house during his first marriage and retained ownership since Kendall had never been listed on the deed. She felt that Dan was not fully committed to their marriage. Dan, on the other hand, saw that his subconscious didn't fully trust Kendall. In the end, they were both right. As part of the divorce agreement, Dan demanded that Kendall return her engagement set to him, and he returned his wedding ring to her. She put the rings in an envelope and handed the envelope to Dan across the conference room. He didn't have an envelope, so he just took the ring off his finger and held it across Kendall's desk where it sat for the entire meeting. As they stood up, finishing the business that had brought them together one last time, Dan had a question for Kendall. Can you tell me why? You've had a good life. I know you loved me and I loved you. Why did you give it all up for an affair? Kendall sighed and looked up for a moment before looking at Dan. I don't know. Boredom? Restlessness? Increase my chances of a promotion? Maybe all three. What do you want me to say, Dan? That I regret cheating on you? I regret getting caught. I can't say I regret cheating or sex, it's just who I am. But you were a good husband. I just wasn't a good wife. I don't know if I could ever be a good wife, to anyone anyway. Dan nodded. Kendall hadn't told him anything he didn't already know or guess. Kendall gathered her purse and papers and turned to leave. Kendall! She turned around and looked at Dan, who pointed to her wedding ring still on the conference table. You should probably take that.